The first sign wasn't the glares, it was the silence. Thomas Whitaker had barely finished unloading the last box when he noticed that tight, unnatural quiet that wrapped around Sycamore Ridge like a shroud. The kind that didn't welcome newcomers, the kind that warned them. Across the street, a woman watering her lawn turned away the moment he glanced her direction. A jogger slowed just long enough to get a good look at him, not a friendly one, then picked up his pace. A couple with a golden retriever ignored his wave completely. No hellos, no small talk, no curiosity, just distance. He told himself it was nothing, just a quiet neighborhood, the type where people kept to themselves. Maybe they needed time. But when his trash bins disappeared, when deep scratches appeared along the side of his black pickup truck, and when a typed note appeared in his mailbox that read, "Some places aren't meant for everyone. You don't belong here," the message became impossible to ignore. Thomas had worked too hard for this house, too many years of double shifts and burned-out holidays to finally afford peace a space to call his own. But peace had no place in Sycamore Ridge, and then came the HOA. It started with warning letters about the height of his fence, the color of his door, even the placement of his garbage cans. Nitpicking at first until it turned aggressive. One morning, a bright orange cone appeared in his driveway with a laminated notice. Garage closed by order of the HOA. Every day he moved it. Every night it returned. This wasn't about bylaws. This was war. And at the center of it all was Edith Blackwell, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, who ruled with smiles, secret meetings, and threats that never needed to be spoken out loud. But what Edith didn't know was that Thomas Whitaker wasn't just another resident, and he wasn't leaving. The cone wars had barely begun when Thomas started noticing other, quieter tactics at play. Things that couldn't be pinned on anyone but felt deliberate, too deliberate to be coincidence. His mail began arriving late, some days not at all. Packages he had tracked as delivered mysteriously vanished from his front steps. One afternoon, he came home to find his porch light broken and muddy footprints leading up to his door. No one in sight, no cameras nearby, no one willing to talk. But they were watching. He could feel it. He'd step outside and see window blinds sway shut. Porch conversations would pause mid-sentence when he passed. It wasn't paranoia. It was performance. A whole neighborhood silently playing the same role in a production he had never agreed to join. One evening, as he walked his usual route around the block, someone finally spoke to him. "Don't take it personal." Thomas turned. A man, probably in his 60s, stood at the edge of his driveway, hands in the pockets of a threadbare cardigan. He had kind eyes, though they looked tired, as if he'd seen all this before. "The name's Walter Green," the man said. "Been here 15 years, long enough to know the rules, and the unspoken ones." Thomas offered a nod, cautious. "Seems like there are a lot of those going around." Walter gave a dry chuckle. "That's Sycamore Ridge. On paper, it's perfect. But if you don't fit the picture, the frame starts pushing back." They stood in silence for a beat, the buzz of cicadas filling the air between them. "Edith Blackwell doesn't like outsiders," Walter said, voice low. "She didn't like the Bennetts, she didn't like Mrs. Cortez, and she sure as hell isn't gonna like you." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "What happened to them?" Walter hesitated, then shook his head. "Let's just say, they're not here anymore." The words hung heavy in the air, a warning, clear and cold. That night, as Thomas stood at his window, watching the darkened street, he realized something that made his pulse slow and his resolve settle deeper. This wasn't just tension, this was strategy. And Sycamore Ridge was a battlefield dressed up like a cul-de-sac. The first letter came 2 days later. It was folded with military precision, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope with the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association seal embossed in gold. Thomas opened it on his porch, the morning sun casting sharp shadows across the page. "Notice of violation," it began. "Your fence exceeds the maximum allowable height under Section 4B of the HOA covenant. Please lower it by 6 inches within 10 business days or face fines." Thomas stared at the paper, then at his fence the exact same height as the one belonging to the neighbor 2 doors down. He didn't bother replying. The second letter arrived 3 days later. "The color of your front door is non-compliant with the approved palette. Please repaint using one of the HOA's designated shades, white birch, moss gray, or brickstone red." He read it twice, then chuckled. It wasn't even subtle anymore. The third letter, stapled to a bright yellow notice taped across his garage, was the most absurd yet. "Effective immediately. Parking in your own driveway is suspended. Your vehicle disrupts the visual cohesion of the neighborhood." That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by the front window, watching. The cone was back, same placement, same silent message. But this time, a shadow moved near it quick, careful, almost graceful. The next morning, as Thomas removed the cone once more, he saw her. Edith Blackwell stood across the street, dressed in a pale blue blouse and beige slacks, her arms crossed like a portrait of suburban royalty. Her eyes met his steady, unblinking. She raised her hand in a small, tight wave, not a greeting, a warning. Later that afternoon, Thomas received a knock at the door. A slim man in khakis introduced himself as the HOA's compliance officer and handed over yet another letter, this time citing him for non-standard mailbox curvature. "Is this a joke?" Thomas asked. The man didn't answer, just walked away like a courier in a bad dream. Thomas stood in his foyer, fists clenched, staring down at the paper in his hands. There was no mistaking it now. Edith wasn't going to let up, and she wasn't sending messages anymore. She was declaring war one letter at a time. By the end of the week, it became a routine. Every morning, Thomas opened his front door and found the same orange traffic cone sitting dead center in his driveway, a fresh laminated notice zip-tied to the top. Garage closed, HOA Directive number 27. And every morning, without fail, he tore the notice off, tossed it into the trash, and moved the cone to the curb. It didn't matter. Each night, it reappeared, same position, same message, as if conjured out of thin air. At first, he thought it might be a neighborhood kid playing a prank. But the laminated notices, the official formatting, no teenager was that meticulous. This was calculated, coordinated. It had Edith Blackwell's fingerprints all over it. Thomas started documenting everything. He took photos each morning, time-stamped, geotagged. He saved every notice in a folder on his desk, labeled neatly, harassment evidence. The file was growing thick, so was his resolve. One night, just past midnight, he sat in the dark behind his living room curtain, watching the street like a hawk. No lights, no movement. Then just after 2 a.m., a figure emerged. Slender, nimble, dressed in dark clothes. They moved quickly, cone in hand, crossing his yard with practiced ease. Thomas reached for his phone, snapped a photo without the flash, then quietly slipped out the back door and crept around the side of the house. But by the time he got there, the figure was gone, vanished down the sidewalk like a shadow swallowed by the night. He sent the photo to Walter Green the next morning. "That's Jonathan Reese," Walter said, squinting at the screen. "One of Edith's lapdogs. Guy works landscaping, but don't let the shovel fool you, he's HOA muscle." Thomas stared at the cone that now sat once again in his driveway. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a message, a test. They were waiting to see how far he'd bend, how much he'd take, whether he'd break first or leave. But what they didn't know was that Thomas Whitaker had spent 20 years charging into burning buildings. This was just smoke. The call came just after 6 a.m., jarring Thomas from a light, restless sleep. His phone vibrated twice before he snatched it from the nightstand. Unknown caller. He almost let it go to voicemail until instinct said otherwise. "Thomas, it's Walter." The voice was hushed, hurried. "You need to get outside, now." Thomas sat up. "What's going on?" "There are 2 squad cars outside your house. And guess who's standing with them, looking like she's about to host a press conference?" Thomas was already moving pants, shirt, keys in hand. He flung open the door just as the first rays of sunlight began stretching across Sycamore Ridge. And there they were, 2 black and white cruisers, lights quietly pulsing, and at the center of it all, like a self-appointed victim, Edith Blackwell. She stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, wearing that same smug expression Thomas had come to associate with trouble. Her voice drifted across the yard as she spoke to one of the officers, gesturing toward his house as if it were a crime scene. Thomas pulled into the driveway and stepped out slowly, calmly, hands visible. The taller officer turned, not aggressive but cautious. "Sir, we received a report of suspicious activity involving a firearm at this residence." "Of course." Thomas kept his tone even. "And I bet I can guess who made that report." Edith's eyes widened in mock offense. "I only called because I heard strange noises. Several people did. It's our duty to be vigilant." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. They weren't buying it. "There's no weapon, no threat," Thomas said. "Just harassment." The younger officer sighed, already tired of the scene. "We're marking this as a false alarm. But ma'am," he turned to Edith, voice firmer, You should be aware filing false police reports can carry serious consequences. For the first time, Edith faltered. She opened her mouth to argue but saw something in the officer's eyes that made her think twice. With a huff, she turned and stalked back to her house, the heels of her shoes clicking across the pavement. As the squad cars rolled away, Thomas stood in the driveway, heart steady, jaw clenched. He had expected this, but now he knew just how far Edith was willing to go. And more importantly, she knew now that he wasn't afraid of her. It happened 3 mornings later. Thomas was finishing his coffee when the low rumble of diesel engines broke the stillness. He moved to the window, squinting into the rising sun. A large utility truck pulled to a stop in front of his house. 3 men in reflective vests climbed out, hauling cones, shovels, and clipboards. One of them pointed at his front yard, then nodded to the others. Thomas stepped outside, mug in hand. "Can I help you?" he called. The lead worker turned. "We've got a work order for emergency pipe repairs," he said, tapping his clipboard. "Underground water lines flagged for a leak. Orders came straight from the HOA." Thomas blinked. A leak? He knew his plumbing was fine. No flooding, no pressure issues, no reports. "Who signed the order?" he asked. The man flipped a few pages. "Edith Blackwell." "Of course." Thomas lowered his mug slowly. "There is no leak," he said evenly. "And you're not tearing up my yard based on some made-up emergency." "Sir," the worker said carefully, "we're just following instructions. If there's an issue, take it up with the association." "I am the issue," Thomas said, reaching into his back pocket. When the badge came out silver, polished, unmistakably official, the tone of the entire crew shifted. The lead worker's brows rose. "You're fire marshal?" "Acting investigator, county certified. You start digging here without verified municipal approval, and I'll have you cited for unauthorized excavation." A long pause. Then, "All right, guys," the lead said over his shoulder. "Pack it up." As the crew gathered their tools, Edith appeared as always across the street, arms folded, lips pinched. She stormed over, heels snapping across the pavement. "You can't do this," she hissed. "This is HOA-authorized work." Thomas turned to her, voice low and measured. "No, Edith. What you tried was fraud. You signed off on a fake repair using HOA funds and city contractors. If you ever try this again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and misappropriation of public services." For the first time, she was speechless. No snark, no smugness, just silence. As she turned and retreated, visibly shaken, Thomas stood tall in the morning light, watching the truck roll away. For once, the street was quiet, but he knew better. This wasn't her last move, just her next mistake. Edith didn't show her face for a few days after the construction crew retreated, but her silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. By the end of the week, Thomas began to feel the shift. Not from Edith herself, but from the people around him. The stares lasted longer. The conversations stopped sooner. Where there had once been passive indifference, now there was avoidance, fear, or worse, complicity. Even Walter Green, once chatty and cautiously supportive, had gone quiet. He offered only a brief nod now, keeping his voice low, his eyes scanning the street before he spoke. "She's turning them," Walter muttered one afternoon, leaning over his fence. "Whispers, half-truths, and lies. It's what she does best." Thomas didn't need the details. He could feel the narrative tightening around him like a noose. At the grocery store, a woman he'd seen at previous HOA meetings approached him near the checkout. "You know," she said, eyes darting, "a lot of people here are saying you don't really belong. Maybe things would be easier if you just moved." Thomas met her gaze with a calm, deliberate smile. "Some people should spend more time minding their own business." She flushed and turned away. Later that evening, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find a woman in her early 50s, brown eyes sharp behind silver-rimmed glasses. She held a manila folder against her chest like it was something sacred. "I'm Clara Monroe," she said. "I used to be the HOA treasurer, before I realized what Edith really was." Thomas stepped aside and she entered without another word. In his kitchen, she laid the folder on the table and opened it to reveal dozens of printed emails, ledger sheets, and handwritten notes. "She's been lying for years," Clara said. "Misusing funds, finding people who opposed her, forging board votes. I tried to speak up, but she buried me in legal threats." Thomas leaned forward. "Why now?" Clara hesitated. Then, with quiet conviction, she said, "Because I saw how you stood up to her. And because if someone doesn't stop her, she'll burn this whole place down just to stay queen. Thomas looked down at the papers, then back at Clara. The tide was turning, and this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The letter came in a thick envelope, hand-delivered and sealed with a golden HOA stamp. Notice of disciplinary review, it read in bold type. The words beneath were carefully chosen, vague but weighty, laced with legalese meant to intimidate. The meeting would be held Friday evening at the Sycamore Ridge Community Hall. Attendance mandatory. Thomas read it once, then again, and then he smiled. By the time Friday arrived, the hall was full. Folding chairs lined the walls. The usual HOA faithful sat close to the front, arms crossed, faces taut with expectation. Others hovered near the back, wary, unsure. Even Walter Green stood near the exit, arms folded tight. At the center of it all, behind a table stacked with papers and microphones, sat Edith Blackwell, poised like a judge presiding over a courtroom of her own making. On either side were her loyal board members, nodding like wind-up dolls. Edith cleared her throat with ceremony. We're here tonight to address a growing concern, the behavior of one resident whose actions have undermined the values of our community. Thomas sat near the front, calm and unreadable. Mr. Whitaker, Edith continued, has repeatedly violated HOA regulations, shown open hostility toward board members, and refused to comply with lawful directives. She held up a file. We've documented over a dozen instances of non-compliance. Thomas leaned forward. Are you done? Edith blinked. Excuse me? You say I've broken rules, but what you've actually done is fabricate violations, harass a resident, misuse HOA funds, and weaponize this organization for personal control. A hush fell over the room. I have evidence, Thomas added, placing Clara's folder on the table. Emails, financial records, forged signatures, all of it. Edith's composure cracked just slightly. Her hand froze mid-turn of a page. You don't have the authority to remove me. This isn't a gated community. You don't own my house, and this meeting? He gestured around the room. It's not a court. It's theater. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Edith's allies looked to her, unsure now. This is absurd, she snapped, forcing a laugh. You simply don't fit in here. Thomas stood. His voice was steady, louder now. Good, because I'm not here to fit in. The room was silent, and for the first time since he moved in, it felt like the silence belonged to him. It was barely a week after the hearing when the sirens came. Thomas jolted upright, halfway through his morning coffee, as two white county enforcement vehicles rolled up to the curb. Their logos were clean, official, nothing like the HOA's printed letters and traffic cones. He was already at the front door when the first inspector stepped out, middle-aged, clipboard in hand, wearing the neutral mask of someone trained to appear both polite and unmovable. Sir, the man said, we received an anonymous report regarding multiple code violations at this property. We'll need to conduct a full inspection. Structural, plumbing, pest-related. Thomas exhaled slowly. Let me guess the complaint came from a concerned neighbor. The inspector said nothing, just nodded toward the house. For nearly 2 hours, they walked through every room. They measured walls, checked water pressure, took photos of every vent, pipe, and outlet. One of them even climbed into the attic. Meanwhile, across the street, Edith Blackwell stood on her porch with a coffee mug in hand and a thin, quiet smirk on her lips. She wasn't even pretending to hide it anymore, but her smirk didn't last long. When the inspection concluded, the younger officer returned to Thomas at the front door. Mr. Whitaker, he said, your property is fully compliant with county code. No violations found. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. So the complaint was false? Technically, yes, the inspector replied, glancing back at the clipboard. And sir, we will be filing a report on the source of the complaint. Thomas smiled just a little. Good. Across the street, Edith's posture stiffened. She turned quickly and disappeared inside, the door slamming harder than she probably intended. By the following Monday, an official notice arrived at every doorstep in Sycamore Ridge. A formal county investigation into the HOA's financial practices and leadership conduct was underway. The ripples spread fast. Neighbors who once turned away now stopped to whisper. Rumors turned to questions, and questions turned to doubts. Then came the audit. Receipts didn't match. Fines had been issued without record. Thousands of dollars were missing, and Clara Monroe's ledgers made it all painfully clear. Edith's grip was slipping, and the cracks in her carefully polished kingdom were finally beginning to show. The final blow came at the emergency community meeting. The room was packed wall to wall, not with whispers this time, but with voices, real ones. People who had once sat quietly now murmured openly, flipping through handouts distributed by the county's investigative team. At the front stood a sharp-eyed woman from the Office of Neighborhood Oversight. Her tone was calm, but every word was a nail in Edith's coffin. "Over $38,000 in HOA funds unaccounted for," she announced, holding up a spreadsheet. "Unauthorized fines, fraudulent maintenance orders, documented abuse of administrative authority." Edith Blackwell sat stiffly at the long table where she had once reigned, her jaw tight, knuckles white. But there was no gavel this time, no smug smile, just silence. Beside her, the other board members had shrunk into themselves, former allies now desperate to distance their names from hers. One had already resigned. Another refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Then came the vote. It wasn't even close. Unanimous removal, immediate disbandment of the current HOA board. And just when it seemed it couldn't get any worse for Edith, two uniformed officers entered from the back of the room. The crowd parted in silence. "Ma'am," one said, voice steady but firm, "we have a warrant for your arrest, embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of public resources." Edith stood up like someone waking from a bad dream. "This is outrageous," she barked. "I built this community." "No," Thomas said softly from the third row. "You poisoned it." The cuffs clicked. A few people clapped. Others just watched, wide-eyed, as the woman who once ruled Sycamore Ridge with fear and fake smiles was led out the front doors. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed. The HOA was restructured under temporary county supervision. A new board was elected, real people, voted in transparently. The arbitrary rules vanished. Fines were rescinded. The orange cones never returned. People started waving again. Even Walter Green showed up one morning with fresh coffee and a folded newspaper. "Told you she'd crack eventually," he muttered, grinning. But for Thomas, the moment of closure came quietly. One evening, as he stepped onto his porch, he saw a "for sale" sign posted in Edith's yard. Her house sat empty, curtains drawn, lawn overgrown. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since moving in, Sycamore Ridge felt like home. Not just a place he lived, a place he had earned. And no one would take that from him again. This story is more than a tale of neighborhood drama. It's a reminder of what happens when fear goes unchecked, and what strength looks like when it's quiet, steady, and rooted in principle. Thomas Whitaker didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't scream, threaten, or retaliate in kind. Instead, he held his ground with dignity, documented the truth, and trusted that integrity, when backed by patience and courage, would win out. In a world where power often disguises itself behind paperwork, politeness, and positions of authority, it's easy to feel small. But this story reminds us, silence doesn't mean surrender, and being outnumbered doesn't mean you're wrong. For older generations who have seen systems rise and fall, this lesson resonates deeply true. Strength lies not in control, but in character. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to leave when others want you gone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.